I now recognize Representative Giffords to summarize her statement for 5 minutes or less. Welcome.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before such a distinguished group of members and such a distinguished group of panelists as well. I proudly represent 9,000 square miles of a southeastern Arizona border district. I have 114 miles of the 2,000 U.S.-Mexico border. My community is directly on the front lines of America's immigration crisis. As you can imagine, immigration is just as polarizing and emotional in my district as it is right here in Capitol Hill. But in southern Arizona, where we are on the front lines, we want members of Congress to roll up their sleeves, to roll up our sleeves, get to work, tone down the hysterics, tone down the rhetoric, and fix this broken system. Along with most of the Arizona delegation, I support comprehensive immigration reform. Chairwoman, you talked about that. Mr. Chairman, you talked about that as well. It is truly the only way that we are going to solve this very complex problem. I know that the topic of today's hearing is solely about border security, but I just want to lay that as a framework, because if we're going to really solve that problem, we need to focus on a comprehensive solution. My district is unique. My district includes the Tucson sector of the Border Patrol, which is the most porous part of the U.S.-Mexico border. In fiscal year 2007, almost 400,000 apprehensions were made by the Tucson sector Border Patrol. 44% of all the apprehensions along the border happen within my district. It's approximately 1,000 illegal crossings every day. Over 950,000 pounds of the 2 million pounds of marijuana received in fiscal year 2007 in the Tucson sector of the Border Patrol. Illegal guns, violence from Mexican drug cartels, international criminals as well are making their way through my border ranches, through my communities, retirement homes, all through southern Arizona. There's a lot of proposals out there. I am pleased to join with Mr. Cuellar in H.R. 1909 because funding the criminal immigration courts is important. I'm also a co-sponsor of Chairman Reyes' Southwest Regional Border Authority Act, H.R. 2068, which is a very important piece of legislation as well. But I've worked with Congressman Bilbray to introduce H.R. 5552, the Border Security Accountability Act. Madam Chair, you talked about the billions of dollars being put towards border security. But we have to ensure that the taxpayers' dollars are effectively being spent. We need transparency and we need accountability within DHS. We need solid data on the apprehensions, detentions, and the deportation process being implemented by the agency. In addition, I believe that members need to have detailed information about the success rates, including exact distance apprehensions take place from the border and the release rates for those apprehensions. So while we continue to put millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars towards the border, I think we have to have a thorough assessment of the staffing, equipment, training, and the policies for all of the border security functions. As our legislation instructs, Congress must demand meaningful data from DHS on the effectiveness and the costly investments. So I'm working as well to make sure that my constituents, that our taxpayers, have an opportunity to evaluate the structures, the operations, and to provide input into the planning of these processes. If we had more input from people on the border, I don't believe that the failures we've seen with the Secure Border Initiative would have happened, where there was no consultation with the local authorities or with the Border Patrol right there on the front lines. Last December, a bipartisan group of 9 lawmakers from the House and Senate joined me as well to study the effectiveness, using a GAO study, of the checkpoints along the U.S.-Mexico border. Because as we build more infrastructure, we have to assure taxpayers and residents that the infrastructure is actually working. I'm pleased to work closely with Chief Gilbert and his staff. We've had a variety of meetings up and down the border. I hope in the question and answer we can get to this, because here, for example, is a meeting of notes with my ranchers on the front lines about what really happens when you have hundreds of thousands of people moving through your community. So a lot's going on. SCAP funding is something very underfunded. We should talk about that as well. So just in closing, Madam Chair, Southern Arizonans, I think, like most Americans, expect their elected officials to tackle not just the easy problems, but the tough problems. The fact that immigration has become polarized, it's become ugly, radioactive, is a reason why Congress has to move. It's become fashionable here in Capitol Hill to talk tough about immigration. But when it comes to the larger immigration crisis as a whole, it is short-sighted to look at an enforcement-only solution. The fact remains that all of it, the border, the visas, the deportation, the citizenship, verification, the Social Security, the green talks, this all is the responsibility of the federal government. We can't just wring our hands. We have to get to work. And if this 110th Congress does not move forward on meaningful legislation coming out of your subcommittees, I think that this 110th Congress will be a failure.
Thank you, Ms. Giffords, and I would just remind you that I wish we had all those pieces of jurisdiction, but the reality is ours is much more limited, and I think you're correct when we talk about staffing and accountability, and I believe the second panel will give us some of that information. We certainly, I know we just took a visit to your, two of our subcommittees just made a visit to your district recently, maybe in the last 2 weeks. And I would just say, as someone whose parents are originally from your border area and who has, I have family on both sides of that border, when I go there and I see what has become of your border, your area, as opposed to what it was like 30 or 40 years ago, you know, people who live there really have a challenge, and we need to do as much as we can. So I appreciate your testimony, and we'll now go to our last